Greet- Greetings, everyone. I'm Jim Martin, one of your U.S. colleagues for these important seminars. Today, we will expand our previous discussion of the wartime experiences of military spouses and intimate partners, and address how best to support military relationships in a time of war. Our colleagues, Karl Castro from the US and Natalia Umeryenkova, will describe and discuss some of the principles and best practices for supporting military couples in responses to the many challenges presented by military service life and military duties, especially the consequences of service members' combat exposures and the impact on relationships. As Karl will highlight, these principles and practices are research-based, derived from over 7 decades of extensive qualitative and quantitative research with American soldiers and their loved ones, and research encompassing both periods of relative peace as well as intense and prolonged combat operations. What is unique today, and for the men and women engaged in Russia's war in Ukraine, is the overall context of a war occurring on your homeland, a war where your military has limited manpower, a war where there is not enough time to adequately train new soldiers, a war of such scope and intensity that there is very limited time for soldiers to obtain the physical and psychological relief from the stress of combat, and for couples and families to experience restorative time together. We also hope to identify some of the cultural differences between the US and Ukraine that will help us better understand Ukraine's experiences. I'm going to highlight a few slides to set a context for today's presentation. Chris, go to the next slide. So important to think about this in terms of the experience of soldiers who are actually at the front engaged in combat. Next slide. Some important realities about combat, and I'm not going to read all of these. You have the slides. But one of the most important issues is the notion that combat impacts every soldier, mentally and emotionally. Next slide. There are some key principles to think about. And again, I'm not going to go through each of these. I want to highlight just one or two. One is the reality that warriors returning from combat frequently report psychological symptoms. This is normal and expected. It's one of the realities of war. The other is that the burden of war is not limited just to returning warriors. It impacts spouses and other loved ones. Next slide. War is not normal. There's nothing about war that is normal. This is a set of quotes from a colleague who wrote passionately and from a movie called Fighting for Life. But there's nothing normal about war, and it will never, ever be normal in people's lives. Next slide. Clearly, there is no soldier who is not either physically or psychologically impacted by war. Next slide. So this is why, for many soldiers, over and over again, thoughts of their experiences are present in their mind, and why war, in a sense, forms its own culture for soldiers, and a culture that they carry with them as they return home, as they return into relationships. Next slide. So for spouses and for significant others, there are a variety of impacts of war and these experiences. Most notably, depression, fear and worry for their loved one. For many, a development of anger, sometimes abusive use of drugs and alcohol. But these are just a few of the many problems that often spouses encounter. Next slide. So again, if we think about in the US, we talk about stages of deployment, and I realize this is somewhat different in terms of this war in Ukraine. But again, soldiers are going to go from home to combat, return home. At some point, there will be an end to their combat experience and hopefully an end to this war. But this is a circular relationship. And again, the stress often mounts and builds during this period. Next slide. So for the spouse and for the soldier, there are often experiences that they encounter. You often hear this in terms of comments like, "You seem different," "You won't talk to us," "You won't open up." For the soldier, a feeling like, "I no longer have a place in this home or in this relationship. All my responsibilities have been taken on by the spouse." And again, remember that there are post-traumatic stress symptoms that are often frequent, both early and sometimes ongoing. We see these in symptoms of anger, distancing oneself in relationships, the use of drugs and alcohol. Next slide. Just go ahead and click through this, Chris. I should have taken it off. Good, stop there. So again, for the spouse and family, there are certain things that are experienced, and the same for the service member upon their return. There are certain experiences, and Karl and Natalia will talk about some of these. The next slide. So again, some important considerations. For me, the most important is to think about having a resiliency-based approach in trying to help individuals and couples develop and retain healthy life balance despite the stress of combat. Next slide. I highlight this slide because I think there are two important considerations. One is the challenge that countries like your own experience in trying to recruit and sustain competent military members and support families during wartime. The second, though, is the reintegration of families and veterans after their combat experiences. And this is something that has begun for many Ukrainian soldiers and will continue for others as this war unfolds. And again, it's important to think about how our systems of care, our government, our nonprofit organizations, how they reach out and provide the kind of physical and psychological help, the kind of social economic well-being that is needed to support the service members' return to civilian life. Next slide. So we're going to talk, among other things, the concept of Battlemind. I'm going to turn this over to Karl and to Natalia. Important to recognize here that we're really talking about an intervention that is trying to help people readjust, that the emphasis is really on adaptive change and a capacity for continuing change as one moves forward as a veteran. Chris, end these here and we'll go on to Karl's slides.
Thank you, Chris. If you want to bring up the Battlemind training for spouses presentation would be great. Perfect. So, Jim, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. And that saved Natalia and I a lot of time in having to review all of the research that went in to building this training. So the slides that you're going to see now is the actual slides that we would show military spouses, primarily women, but I think in all of our training, there was one male in the room, but they're primarily women, but not exclusively, not exclusively. So we need to be thinking more broadly. And we've given this training in the United States with spouses alone, but it's intended to be presented with both couples together in the same room at the same time, hearing the same message. Because oftentimes when only one or the other is in the room, they will only hear things that they want to tell the other, and they won't give them sort of the complete picture. So what we like to do is have both couples in the room at the same time, and then they can also interact with each other during the presentation. So it's really designed to be conversational and not sort of what we call didactic or pedagogical, where I'm just standing up in front of the room or somebody else is standing up in front of the room giving the presentation. It's really designed to hear from the participants, the participants to share their experiences, to validate in many ways what they're thinking, what they're feeling, their own behaviors. So as all of the Battlemind training, for those of you who are familiar with it, really the main goal of the Battlemind training is threefold. It's to normalize symptoms and reactions. Now, we don't say this in the training, okay? So you're not going to see that on the slides. But the content of the slides is developed to normalize symptoms, reactions, emotions, experiences. The second thing it's tried to do is to give skills to both the partner and the soldier, the service member, that they can use. So it's sort of skill-based. And then the third thing it's intended to do is really identify when either the spouse needs to seek help or when the soldier or service member needs to seek help. So it does those three things. So just keep those three things in mind. Now, before we jump into this, I also just want to emphasize this is a very, very American-focused training. All right. So it tries to embed in it the American culture and the American way of doing things. Now, you may see in the training, oh, that's similar to what we do in the Ukraine. But you're also going to see some things you can say that would never work in the Ukraine because our culture is not like that. And there, change that. Change it so it matches your culture and matches the resources that you have in your country. Okay, so I can't stress that enough. But just keeping in mind the three things it's trying to do, again, normalize symptoms, reactions, emotions, behaviors, feelings, give skills to both the spouse, the partner, and the service member. And then three, I help them identify when they will need to seek further help. Okay, so just keeping those three principles in mind. And Dr. Amy Adler and I have written lots of chapters and lots of papers about how you adapt training in this context. And I think I've already sent all of those to many of you, but if anyone else would like copies, just ask me or ask one of your colleagues in this training. I'm sure they have it. So Natalia, do you want to add anything else before we jump into these slides?
Thank you, Carlo. I would like to add just a couple of words. First of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity to discuss this subject in this audience of experts and specialists. It is an honor for me to work on it with you. I used to base my research on Karl's articles and open resource sources on Battlemind, and I can confirm that this approach works well in our conditions, and we will talk about this in greater detail later on.
And I should also thank my co-presenter as well for being so flexible in joining me. I feel very, very privileged to have Natalia here alongside me, and Jim as well. So thank both of you very much. So let's just go to the next slide, Chris, and we're going to go through these very quickly because Jim has already made a lot of these points. So this slide here just makes the point that military life is hard. And it's even harder when one of the partners is gone. That's what this says. So being gone, being in combat, fearing injury and death to another service member is hard. So I'm just going to, you've heard this before in many other talks, so I just want to skip through this one. So next slide. But there's some value to being in the military. In the U.S., and this doesn't apply necessarily to every country, but the, healthcare, pride in service, defending your nation, these are all really positive aspects that will alter and change a person for a lifetime. You saw that in Jim's opening slide. So I don't want to beat that point up any more than just to say that. Natalia, did you want to say anything on this slide?
I would add only one thing. All the aspects of experience of the family which lives through the deployment stage are actual in the conditions of our country. It is all important for our country. Of course, we have some peculiarities because the time for restoration is quite short and it is not possible for the serviceman to switch off and really relax, but we understand that the preparation for the deployment is also important and we see it in our work.
Yeah. Thank you for those additional comments. Next slide. One of the things that you will see throughout this presentation is this concept, Army-centric family, ACF. So you're going to see that referred to in this presentation. And what that really means is that we can't just focus on the soldier. We've got to focus on the soldier and the family. So we call this the Army-centric family approach. If you just focus on the service member at the exclusion of the family, exclusion of the spouse, and then try to fit them in at the end, it's not going to work. It'll be clumsy. It will be disorganized. You've got to think about the family holistically, comprehensively in the beginning when you build systems of support. And I'm talking systems of prevention, treatments, intervention, and then post-support, that whole life cycle that Jim talked about in his introduction is really, really important. And we call that the Army-centric family. And we define it here in American terms. So, married life in the Army means spouses need to be highly independent and capable of accomplishing all essential family functions. So think about that. Alone if necessary, because the soldier will be deployed. Now, this is what I call one of the paradoxes of military service, because usually when two people get married, they like each other and they want to spend time with each other, right? We think that's really fundamentally, when you think about it, what is marriage? I like you, I love you, I want to spend time with you. But what happens in the military is we separate them. We separate them. When you go off on deployments, when you go to combat, you are separated. You're not together. So things that you would think about in a traditional marriage, where there's going to be this shared understanding, this shared decision making, where you rely on each other for support, emotional support, physical support, intimacy, is gone. The spouse now has to do all of these things on their own. And that can create a lot of friction, a lot of challenges. Okay. So we say spouses need to be resilient. And this is one of the things that spouses have told us in interviews. They say we have to roll with the blows. Okay. So they feel they're constantly under attack, constantly being pummeled, but they just have to sort of roll with it. Okay. So one of the things that we do to build resilience is we try to focus on those positive aspects of deployments, the positive aspects of separation. And so what could be positive about me not being with my husband or me not being with my wife? That's what we try to do. So resilience building, we take a very positive psychology approach, right? We try to recognize the challenges, but we try to do it in what we call a strength-based model, where we try to say, what are the skills and strengths that you have or that you will develop because of these experiences? And we do that in all of our Battlemind training. It's a strength-based approach. Again, I can't strengthen it enough. It's strength-based. It's not a weakness. We don't focus on weaknesses. We focus on strengths. So what are you good at? Let's make you better at it. All right. We don't focus on weaknesses, but we acknowledge that there are challenges. So we're not going to try to do what we call in the States Pollyannish. I don't know if you have that phrase in the Ukraine, where we try to make things sound, oh, everything's going to be fine. And but we don't do that. As Jim talked about in combat, right? Death and injury and dying, that's inherent in combat. We're not going to minimize that, but we're going to try to say, how can we, despite all of this horror, the impact that combat has, how can we still grow from that? Many of you I know have heard the concept of post-traumatic growth. We don't use those words in our training, but it's similar to that. How can you use your experiences and be a better person and grow from those experiences? So that's what we try to embed in our model. And so you can see that, but in this training, the focus is on spouse resilience. Okay. So, but again, from an Army family centric perspective. Okay. So from this holistic perspective, how do we talk about resilience among spouses? And Natalia, I know you want to say something about spouse resilience, so please. Oh, no?
Well, without a doubt, it's important to understand that if we speak about Ukrainian realities, there's definitely a need to strengthen the strengths without overlooking the weaknesses, because the war is ongoing for a long time and there's a lot of exhaustion going around. But we also can see very well when we host the events for spouses, support groups for spouses, even if it's not like what Karl is saying, in our psychosocial support of families of the military, we can see that it's a very powerful situation when we rely on resilience and on the strengths that appear, the new skills that appear that the spouses can rely on. Then they become more resilient, and then they say themselves that they get more capacity to support the husband who is in the front lines at the moment.
Okay. Now, and one of the things that we're going to talk about in this very last sentence on this slide is strengths can lead to conflicts. Okay. That's also a paradox. So if you have a spouse, a wife who's really independent, can make decisions without you, the service member may feel worthless, not needed. as an example. We're going to talk about that in more detail. But I just want you to know that just because the spouse is stronger, that doesn't mean that there's no conflicts anymore and that the relationship is very fine, because the service member may feel threatened. Oh, my wife doesn't need me anymore. She's going to leave me. She's going to find somebody better than me. So all of these thoughts can be going through the minds of the service member and also through the minds of the spouse too. So it's not a one-way thing. Again, we have to really look at the relationship. Now, before I jump to the next slide, just one more point. We're not going to talk about children really that much today. That's a really, really important topic, and we're thinking about having some separate presentations on children and how they're affected, but age is important, and so there are a lot of factors there. But if there's interest in presentations on children, we can certainly arrange to have other experts come in and talk about that. In fact, Jim and I have already been throwing around names. We know a lot of people who would love, I think, to share their experiences. But I don't want you to think we've forgotten them in this presentation, because we haven't forgotten them. We're just trying to stay focused really more on the spouse in this presentation. But understanding children are part of it, parents are part of it, siblings are part of it, the family's a part of it. Okay, so we're not going to talk about that today, but I just want you to know we think about this from a very holistic perspective all the time. So without beating that up anymore, I'm going to stop there. So let's jump to the next slide. Okay, so these are the topics, if you will, or the themes that we develop for Spouse Battlemind. And you can see, if you understand English, the red letter, if you read it down, it spells resilience. It's kind of a mnemonic, like, well, what is it? What does that mean? And so there are 10 areas we focus on. Are there more than 10 areas? Absolutely, there are more than 10 areas. In the Ukraine, there may be different areas, but these are the ones, and I'm going to leave this up for a minute because we're not going to have enough time to go into the detail of why we picked these 10 and why they're important. You have all of this material. I just want folks to look at it, and we will try to hit on as many of these can. We may not get through the whole presentation. That's okay. The point is to understand why we develop these and what we see. And Natalia and I are happy to, jump ahead to ones if someone wants to type in the chat, hey, let's talk about this, or let's talk about extra parenting roles. That's the very last one. Let's talk about new roles and skills. Let's talk about becoming emotionally stronger. Let's talk about independence. So we can talk about any of those if there's a particular one that folks are interested in. I think they're all important. There are others, as I said, that are not on the list. So I'm going to ask Natalia just to comment on this list and things that she sees that maybe need to be added to the list, or things that aren't maybe as important in the Ukraine as they are in the U.S. and from the U.S. experience. So Natalia, please.
Karl, I think everything is necessary. All of these aspects are necessary, are quite important, and we can detailize them go into a lot of details, so we can combine them. But this basically covers all aspects that come up as challenges during the deployment and during service at large.
Okay. All right. Chris, next slide. So one of the things when you look at these slides as we present them, we make some obvious observations. And so the very first one is the spouse is closest to the soldier. Now, other service members are also very close to the soldier too. And that's what we focus on in the soldier battle mind training. But the spouse knows the soldier probably the best in many areas and really is in the best position to notice changes in their physical and mental health. Okay? So the spouse then is in a unique position to recognize when the soldier may need help. Okay? So we're just taking advantage of sort of what's happening naturally. Okay? Now, here's the conflict that the soldier may not want help. Right? That's called stigma. We've got a lecture coming up on that this summer about stigma. And most soldiers and most husbands want to appear masculine and strong in front of their spouse or partner. And they don't want to be thought of as having a mental health issue or a physical health issue, because that for them may be a sign of weakness. And culturally in the US, the men are the strong, they're the protector, right? And so they may not want to be told that. Some men don't like to be criticized. Some women don't like to be criticized. So these are natural conflicts that arise when someone needs help or needs to change some behavior when they're criticized, because they'll take it as a criticism, not as someone who cares about you, who loves you, and who wants to help you. Okay, so this is a potential conflict. And you'll see this, we say potential conflicts on all of them because it may or may not be a conflict. You may have a partner, a soldier, who wants help and takes feedback in the spirit it's intended. That's not been my experience for most soldiers, though, I'll be honest. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I just don't see it very often. The norm morally is, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, you're overreacting. That's usually the response you get back from soldiers. Okay? So next slide. And then here is the slide where then we say, well, what are some actions that can be taken? And not just what can the soldier do differently, but what can the spouse do differently? So we try to balance this with spouse actions and soldier actions. And you'll see this parallel on all of the slides because it's a relationship, and a relationship is about giving and taking. It's about compromising. It's about wanting a stronger relationship with the person you're with and understanding that the dynamics of relationships change. So in this particular one here, realize spouses need to understand that they may not be the person that their soldier, their partner, their husband's going to accept help from. Okay? But they need to ensure they get help. Right? So they may have to get other unit buddy, another family member to intervene. Okay, now we do this all the time, but not usually systematically. Kids do this all the time too. They try to get the older siblings will try to get the younger sibling to ask a parent for something because the parent's more likely to do it if the younger sibling wants it than the older sibling, or, oh, dad likes you more than me, that kind of stuff. My kids do that to me all the time. It's a similar behavior. And then just recognize that resources will mostly be focused on soldiers. One of the things we hear a lot about from spouses and wives is that all the resources are focused on the soldier. And that's not 100% true, but it's probably 95% true, okay? Because we want to keep the soldier in the fight. We want to keep the soldier healthy. So they often feel they get what's ever left, and sometimes it could be minimal or nothing. So sometimes you just have to accept the reality of how organizations and cultures function. But then the soldier needs to accept help from others. So the soldier needs to learn to accept help, needs to learn to accept help from their spouse without becoming angry and defensive. And they shouldn't push away or lash out. I mentioned this earlier. Well, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm fine. You just don't understand what I've been through. And then a spouse, of course, will say, well, you've never told me what you've been through. Well, never mind, and then they stomp off, right? So it's those kinds of things, just really improving communication. We talk about that. And then we also say, try not to avoid major problems. And we say here, or self-treat. And what we mean by that in the United States is soldiers like to treat themselves. right? So if something's wrong, you could go to the internet, you could look it up and say, okay, here's my symptoms. What could be wrong with me? Okay, well, the problem with that, of course, is you're going to focus on like the most catastrophic thing available. Oh my God, I got cancer. I'm dying of cancer, right? That kind of thing. And some things you can treat yourself, like exercise, cutting down on drinking, eating properly, all of the things that no matter what ails you, people will tell you to do, right? They're the big five, right? The big five: exercise, get plenty of sleep and rest, eat a good diet, improve your relationships with people, right? Relationships are huge. For those of you who've heard me talk before, I think the entire world, our entire mental health, our entire emotional health, psychological health is determined on having positive relationships with people. Okay, so these are the things they always say to do. They always say to do, no matter what. You've got cancer, broken arm, broken leg, mental health issue, doesn't matter. It's always these 5 things plus some other things. So don't always try to engage in the seriousness of it, right? Sometimes your leg's broken. Don't try to set it yourself. You're going to have to go to a doctor, right? If you have a deep wound, you're going to have to get stitches in it. So those kinds of things. So I'm going to stop there. I've been talking quite a bit. I want to turn it over to Natalia now and get her input on this slide.
Thank you, Karl. I think I will give a few examples. For 2 years now, we've had a functioning telephone support line where the soldiers can call, the family members can call. On one hand, it's a kind of service line. On the other hand, we have a chance to study the matters that the people are coming in to us with. And very often the spouses and mothers are calling if the soldiers are unmarried. And they're saying, how can I help my soldier, my next of kin? Because I can see that he needs help, but he doesn't want to seek it. What can I do myself? Because I can see that his sleep is disrupted, and so on and so forth. So on one hand, it's out there. Even when they are on a short vacation, when their body has not rehabilitated yet. Another case is when spouses are seeking phone consultations, phone advice, if we sort of summarize it.
So another question the spouses ask, how can I help him at a distance? Because quite often the serviceman could voice their concerns, their problems, and the wives are thinking about how can they help them. And for instance, the spouses can tell the serviceman to which services he can address, because it might not even occur to him that they could call a specialist and work with him on the phone, or contact the military psychologist or someone else.
So one of the things that changes our emotions and how we express our emotions to each other during prolonged separations, and also particularly during combat. And one of the things I want to highlight is that we deal with separations in different ways. So sometimes when soldiers are getting ready to leave and they know they're going to be gone a long time, they will emotionally detach. And it looks like they are pushing away the spouse. The spouse may also emotionally detach. And it's easier when someone leaves if you emotionally detach. Okay, it's psychologically healthy. It's very common and very normal across all cultures to do this. Okay, so this is not a unique American culture, but that looks like can be driven by culture. And but the most important thing is how do we so one is don't be alarmed by those changes. That, geez, you know, it sounds like you're happy to be leaving. Those kinds of emotions, when it's actually not, it's this emotional detachment that makes leaving easier. But then we need to reestablish those emotional bonds. Natalia was talking about that, you know, when you leave and come back and leave again. Reestablishing emotional bonds takes time. And you're going to hear this throughout the entire presentation, and you'll hear it throughout all the Battlemind training. Time is an ally. Take your time in reestablishing emotional bonds. In all of these tasks and actions we talk about, take your time in reestablishing or reassuming new roles. Take your time in drinking. Go slow. So don't come back. You know, in the U.S., we have alcohol-free deployment environments. And when soldiers come back, they just get drunk every night because they have no tolerance for it. So we say, go slow on everything. And just keep in mind, soldiers, particularly men, have huge difficulty showing and talking about their emotions. By the way, I have seen this across every culture. This is not unique to the American culture. Many men, I would say most men, have difficulty expressing their emotions, other than the emotions of anger, resentment, and then shutting down. So they show no emotions. So this is also common. It's also culturally driven as well. So, but I've seen it in every culture, in every military. It's a problem. Men have difficulty expressing how they feel. Although we know they have those skills, because you've just watched a football match and you can see all the emotions that men show, from happiness to sad, disappointment, anger, euphoria, all the emotions. So they're capable. They just don't show them in the right places, in the right times. We've got to work with men on that. I'm no good. I'm no better at it. Even though I know all of this cognitively, I'm no good at showing my emotions either at the right place in the right time. I screw up. I get angry. I detach. So I'm not saying I've figured it all out and here's the solution. I have not. But we just need to recognize, spouses just need to recognize this. Spouses know this already, but they just need to recognize this. The most important thing for soldiers in here is to appreciate the difference between sex and emotional intimacy. Men see intimacy and sex as one and the same. They are very different. And having conversations about soldiers and understanding that is really important, even just at the cognitive level. Like when you say a wife wants to be intimate, you say, well, we had sex last night. That's not what she's talking about, right? So we really have those conversations in the male Battlemind training, but it's important to have these conversations with both of them in the room. Remember, I said ideally this training is given with both in the room so they can hear it at the same time. Okay, so they're hearing this message at the same time, not, you know, the spouse reporting back what was said, the soldier reporting back what was said, but hearing it at this time becomes really important. So I'm going to stop there and let Natalia make comments on this slide as well.
I would like to add 2 comments. The first comment is related to our Ukrainian realities when the servicemen are away from their homes for maybe 6 months or even for a year with very short leaves. So they are away from their homes and they are under conditions of constant threat to life, and so they get detached, and some emotional ways of communication are lost in the family. And sometimes if you don't know about this peculiarity, it might seem that love is lost because you can't hear this emotional contact with your husband when you talk with him on the home, and women start worrying about this, and it is good when both the spouse and the serviceman know about these changes, and when one of them starts worrying, they can talk about it openly, and a lot of education is required in this respect. And the second thing I wanted to say, when we carried out a training course for the spouses who visit their servicemen, it's hard to talk about emotions for everyone, but if you use some interactive aspects, if you use understanding what is happening to them and that they are doing something together, then it is possible to restore the emotional contact very quickly when we are just talking about it. So it is important to explain these changes and what can be done about it.
Excellent. Thank you, Natalia. Next slide, Chris. So one of the things that is important is military service, and particularly when there's a war going on, it entails sacrifice. The most important thing here is that the spouse make sacrifices in support of the soldier to help them accomplish the mission. There's no question about that. This is really for senior leaders to understand that spouses make sacrifices in support of the soldier to support the military mission. This is why we take a family-centric approach, because of the sacrifices that spouses are making. And oftentimes these sacrifices are not appreciated, okay, are not appreciated. Spouses develop a sense of being part of the military, part of the Army. Their identity often in the United States will be very strongly linked to the military. And they sometimes will feel very proud of the sacrifice they're making, the help that they're doing, the volunteering they do to help other spouses. So spouses help other spouses, soldiers help other soldiers, veterans help other veterans. I mean, that's the culture of the military, at least in the U.S. And I do appreciate that our culture, the American culture of supporting the military and supporting the veteran is phenomenal. And I'll be honest, and I say this with some pride, not as a criticism, but I don't know of any country in the world that supports the military and the veterans to the extent that the United States does. We do a phenomenal job. I wish every country in the world treated their military families and veterans the way the United States does. That doesn't mean the United States is perfect, so I'm not saying that. But the amount of resources that we give to the military and the veteran communities are huge, very large. I think for example, our Department of Veterans Affairs budget in some countries is the entire national budget, as an example of how much, and our military is about 4 or 5% of the total population. So to give you some sense of how much money the military and the veterans get. But so we have this very strong sense of pride in service. Spouses have pride in service. But oftentimes soldiers will make it sound like, I'm in combat. That's a lot harder than what you're doing. You've not sacrificed as much as I've sacrificed. And it becomes this competition that the spouse then is not allowed to voice concerns or complaints about their sacrifice because the soldiers use, I've sacrificed more than you. And this is a potential conflict when this happens. And I'm going to turn it over to Natalia. See, is this something that happens in the Ukraine? And if it does, how does it play out? So, Natalia, please comment on that.
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the situations. Of course, there are different cases, and in some cases, the spouse and the serviceman are in close contact and then talk about many things, and they understand the difficulties and challenges, and then there is no problem. But there are also other situations when these things are being told, and it looks like a kind of sacrifice competition. Who made great sacrifice, the spouse or the soldiers? Even though the psychologists who work with servicemen and with the families, they should explain the importance of the contribution of both sides. Otherwise, this conflict will just deepen unless the proper education is carried out. So yes, it exists. Of course, it is different in different situations, but education is of utmost importance.
Thank you. And now we're on the independence, and you can see from the time we're not going to get through all these slides, and I apologize for that. But I think it's more important that we do this more systematic. By the way, if anyone wants for us to jump to one of the themes, please just type it in the chat and we'll hop ahead. I do want to talk about independence though, because it's really important. And I'll just say this about it. And I said it in the beginning. Spouses have to make decisions to get things done for the family. Full stop. They have to do that. The spouse, in the absence of the soldier, in absence of their husband or wife, will have to set priorities and use their time that they think is best, the best way to use their time. The potential conflict is the soldier may not like those priorities. The soldier may have different priorities, but the soldier's not there. And the second thing is the soldier may feel left out, may be left out of the decision-making in the setting of the priority. So this is a potential conflict. Okay, next slide. And here is where we just have to accept reality. Soldiers have to accept reality that their spouse is going to be independent. The spouse is going to make decisions. And they have to trust their spouse. Trust is a huge issue. I should have mentioned this early on, but trust is a huge issue. Not only trust in terms of the wife, the spouse being faithful, and I'm talking faithful, sexually faithful, not going to cheat on the service member while they're gone with the men who aren't far forward, but also trust the spouse to make decisions that's in the best interest of everyone, especially when it comes to spending money, right? So in the United States, this is a big deal, right? Who gets to spend the money? In my family, it's very easy. My wife controls all the money. I don't get to make any of those decisions. I get brought in on decisions, but the decision's already been made. I'm aware enough to know that the decision's been made. I'm just being told the decision, but it's asked like, oh, you think this is okay? Well, you've already decided. So part of it is just kind of learning to let go because you trust the other person to make the best decisions, okay? And the spouse just needs to remember that the soldier is still part of the family, part of the team, right? Be sensitive to that. Don't say, well, I'm making this decision, so I don't even know why I'm bothering wasting my time. You need to involve the soldier to the greatest extent that you can. So, Natalia, would you like to comment on that? Natalia, can you hear me? Would you like to make a comment on that?
just a brief thing to add. In order to come back to the distribution of responsibility, what is very useful, as our practical experience shows, is when partners talk about the decisions they take if it is related to both of them and their family, and then the serviceman feels involved in the family matters, and then when he is back for a short leave, it's easier for him to rejoin the family and feel involved, and it's also helpful when he comes back home for a longer period. All the examples I share with you are based on the consent of my clients. And in one situation, one spouse told me that she learned how to drive a car, and she was not going to give back to her husband this car, and she said she already told him, and then they had to arrange somehow by phone how they will tackle the situation. Yes, in any aspects, we have to underline the importance of talking it over. Thank you.
Excellent. Next slide, Chris. One of the things that Natalia brought up is that you feel overworked, you feel fatigued, you feel you can't continue at this high level of supporting, maintaining the soldier while they're gone. It happens year in, year out. The war now in Ukraine is in its third year. It's huge, very long time to maintain readiness, to maintain your level of motivation, your level of enthusiasm. And this is always a challenge. This is always a challenge. But what we find oftentimes is relationships get stronger because of enduring and being able to overcome and sustain themselves during these very challenging times. And it does prepare families for future challenges. So we hear that a lot too in the US, at least in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that we were involved in. But there is this sort of, and I mentioned this earlier, this potential conflict about the prioritization of work over family, where sometimes the soldier can be so focused on their military role, and understandably so, that the spouse, the partner, will feel that their relationship and the family is being neglected. And this is this sort of this tension between work family balance. You know, you're in a war, obviously that's really important, but then you have a family and they're really important. And so getting that right balance is often a struggle. And it's just important to understand that there's no simple solutions to that other than what Natalia had already mentioned, which is really effective communication. And of course, you want an organization and a nation that's going to support the family during these prolonged conflicts, and really any conflict, but especially during long conflicts. Natalia, did you want to say anything on this slide?
I would like to note that in our case, Karl, you've already mentioned some of this, that duration is playing a huge role there because people are getting exhausted, and we as specialists who are working with this target audience, target group, we need to find new strength, new energy every time, to make it happen, to remember what brought these two people together, what common things we have, what similarities they have, how can they overcome this challenge, even if they may not be communicating so closely emotionally, because they may not have a chance, but we have to keep going back to their commonalities, to what keeps them together. And maybe some aspects, if that is applicable at some point when this work, when this communication is ongoing, is what they are planning in the future, even if it's some kind of very sort of short-term future, because this exhaustion really affects relationships in our conditions now, because you don't know when it's going to be over, how long it's going to last. So we keep thinking back about the support mechanism that they had as a couple and what kept them together. Thank you, Karl.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, next slide. So I'm just going to, this is a really important slide. I could talk about this slide for an hour. But let me just say this, and it's something that Natalia has already mentioned. How do you maintain your relationship when you are both in different places? This is a concept that I call loving at a distance. How do you do that? How do you do that? And I don't have the solution to that either. But I do know that you need to tell each other you love each other. You love them. You need to say, I love you in every interaction you have with them on email, phone, FaceTime, no matter what mechanism, in letters, no matter how you're communicating, you need to let your partner know you love them. You also need to say thank you to each other. There are these three phrases that you need to say in relationships all the time to each other. I love you, thank you, and I'm sorry. If your spouse, your partner thinks you did something wrong, even though you may not think you did something wrong, it's best to say, I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, etc. So 3 things I always tell, especially young people, learn to say with enthusiasm, with sincerity, not with a glib comment. I love you. Thank you. I'm sorry. Now, I'm being very proscriptive here. Those are 3 things that everybody likes to hear from their partner. Everyone likes to hear those things if they're said with sincerity, they're said with honesty. Okay? Here's the thing. If you say these words enough, you'll start believing them, even if you don't. Okay? So part of this process is do the behavior, the attitudes, beliefs, emotions will follow. Okay, this is psychology 101. All right, but I love you. Thank you. And you can say these in different ways. I appreciate everything you do. You're wonderful, right? There's lots of ways to say it. All right, I'm just giving you the 3 simple ones. And then I'm sorry. Don't fight over trivial things. Don't fight over trivial things. Just say I'm sorry and move on. Let it go. So I'm going to stop there. Natalia, you want to say anything about on this slide?
I'm smiling like that because these 3 things are probably the golden phrases that are applicable ideally for everyone, that everyone could bring on board in their communication with partners. And maintaining relationship at a distance with the experience of wives of the military, of the soldiers, even if the soldier has warned that he's not going to be in communication, maybe when a person is emotionally closed in, when the wife continues communicating with the words that you just mentioned, with some photographs, some pictures, some elements that he likes. Sometimes somebody likes jokes and then you send them funny pictures, photos and videos with kids at home. And then it becomes like a lifeline. Just like the military were saying at our training events. When 5 days later, I'm going through this messaging conversation, this is something I can rely on when I come out of action. And when both partners understand this, even if it's a one-sided conversation, one-sided involvement of a spouse, it's still a very supportive thing. And for both of them, by the way, even though it may seem that only one of them is doing it. Thank you.
Chris, next slide. This slide here basically just says when a soldier is gone, that the spouse, the partner, will develop new support networks, new friends, develop new interests, have new social groups that they associate with. And the soldier may not like the groups, may not like the new friends that their partner or spouse have developed. They may feel threatened by these new relationships. So this is something that we see in the States. And next slide, Chris. And these are sort of some actions that we think the spouse and soldiers can take to sort of overcome them. So the first thing, and I mentioned trust earlier, it's also honesty. So the spouse should introduce their partner and the soldier to these new friends. Don't hide friendships. In particular, if you have a friend, a male friend, this may be unique to the United States. Men do not like their wife having male friends because they think that's going to lead to sexual relations, etc. And the spouse shouldn't expect necessarily that the soldier's going to accept all of the new friends. And I've already mentioned, especially the opposite sex. The soldier, though, needs to understand your spouse needs new friends and needs new social networks in order to function effectively while they're gone. That's a good thing if your spouse has support while you're gone. Now, soldier may not like that they're getting support from other people or other groups, but that reality is the spouse needs to do that. The spouse needs, the partner needs to form a new group.
Natalia, Kyle seems to be frozen. Do you want to pick up and add some comments?
Yes, Jim, thank you. In our experience in the Ukrainian reality, and not just in our specific experience, when we are communicating with partners, we are observing this issue. Very often, a way out of this is when wives are building their own community groups or when they have groups in the city, support groups. But very often it happens that the military are concerned, that the servicemen are concerned that the wives will be telling something about them. And they think it could be some kind of information that they don't know about others. We had the experience when we were making some kind of events for families, activities for families of a specific unit. So it's very important that wives are telling their husbands what happens at these events, regardless of whether the activities are based on these things. So it's important that the wives explain what they're doing. How is that safe for the soldier? How that helps and supports the family. And then a new circle, a new environment of a wife becomes familiar to the soldier. The soldier starts trusting this better, more, starts supporting this new experience, new friends, new communities. And then that strengthens the family as well. Thank you.
I might add, I see Karl is back. I might add one comment, and that's that these relationship challenges often work in the opposite direction, where soldiers have close friends and buddies from the unit, and the spouse often feels threatened because those relationships are so strong, or that the soldier wants to spend time with that military buddy. So again, as Karl has talked about, it's important that these become issues of conversation between the soldier and their loved one. Karl, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, thank you. Well said. So next slide, Chris. So this slide here recognizes, in this sort of resilience point, recognizes that the spouse, the partner, will have expanded and new responsibilities. And that the spouse, in many ways, is taking charge of the family, is in charge of the family during the soldier's absence. And the strength, of course, is that the spouse becomes, more assertive, becomes more competent in what they're doing, and these are all very positive. The spouse will establish effective routines that I mentioned. The spouse will set the schedule, set the priorities for not only the family, but for the children, if there are children. And the soldier may not like those changes and may want to return to the way things used to be. This is a natural conflict. Next slide. So what we try to do is emphasize that the soldier needs to realize children, to include animals. We've not talked about pets, but makes me think of this here is pets and children, they like routines. Okay, so if anyone has a pet, a dog, I'm talking dogs now, not cats. I don't know if cats like routines, but I know dogs like routines. I'm a dog person. And dogs like to eat at the same time. They like to go for walks at the same time. They need routines and predictability, and children especially do. Adults like it as well. We just sometimes don't appreciate it as much until you get older. When you get to my age, you love routine. Routine is like you live by routine the older you get. And so part of it is just understanding these changes have happened, that the wife is now more assertive. I think that's a good thing. Wife is more independent, more confident, which is really what resilience is really about, is having confidence that you can overcome things, making decisions that and executing those decisions. But a soldier will want to come in and try to change things that are working, right? We call it don't fix what's working. Instead, we tell the service member, the soldier, ask how you can help, right? Who doesn't like help? Going to your partner, you're supposed to say, hey, how can I help? I see you're busy. What can I do to help? And sometimes they're surprised you ask them that, but it's right up there with I love you, thank you, I'm sorry. Number 4 would be how can I help, right? If I was going to add a 4th one, I stopped at 3, but if I was going to add a 4th one, it would be how can I help? So this is what we try to convey. So Natalia, please.
Yes, Karl, I would like to add regarding pets. There is a point, and there are like live examples. When there is a certain discipline, certain routine, the serviceman is coming in, he comes into a short vacation, And so for him, the interaction with his dog may give the speediest recovery. And then all kinds of rules that the wife built before are going down the drain. The whole process gets overturned. On one hand, there is understanding that this is his therapeutic support, rehabilitation. And on the other hand, there is an understanding that he's going back in a few days. And by and large, everything needs to be fixed back. So, and it works really well when in the context of conversations, the spouses are saying, okay, these are the rules for now. We're interacting with children, we're interacting with families, with pets now. And then when the soldier comes back home, he can understand that there are some new rules and he's going back. And so he shouldn't, rush in to change all the processes to maintain this balance that of what has been before and what they want to accomplish in this short vacation time.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm very conscious of time, and I sort of warned everyone that I knew we would probably run out of time and not get to all the slides. So what I want to do is stop with your permission, and Natalia and I and Jim will take questions for the last 10 minutes. And of course, I'm available. So if anyone, when you look at the remaining three spouse Battlemind concepts that we developed, please just email me, or we can jump on a Zoom call and I can go over those in more detail. Natalia and I can do them in more detail. I'm sure Jim would love to join us as well. But I do want to open it up for questions because I know I've done way too much talking, but I wanted to give you a sense of why and how these concepts develop. So I'm going to shut up and see if there are any questions from anyone. So questions. Or was Natalia and I so clear that there's no questions at all? You're in complete agreement with everything we said? Can we assume that? I'm joking, of course, but
I wanted to ask this. When there is a reverse situation, when there is domestic violence and the wife is trying to tell about this, and people are telling her, oh, you have to be patient, he's a hero, and so she is left alone with that problem. What to do?
Natalia, did you want to take that first, or you would like me to comment on that?
Okay, I can briefly respond, and then you, Karl, maybe add something. First of all, nobody should tolerate any kind of violence, and this is completely true also in our realities. And if a woman contacts a specialist, he should organize the process in such a way that she is in a safe place and her family, her children are in the safe place. And Ukraine, we have a national program for combating home violence, which involves mobile groups and national police. So probably the real question is what's the best way to tackle the situation like that, because sometimes the spouses might not know what's the best way to resolve the situation in a way that is safe for them. So the best is to contact a specialist who would help.
Great answer. I just want to say that the U.S. domestic violence is taken very, very, very seriously. and the military has a very, very important role in this as well. What Jim and I will do for a future webinar, we will have this as its own topic. It's a really important topic, but Natalia, I'm so happy to hear that the most important thing is safety for everyone, and everyone needs to not only be safe, they need to feel safe in their environment. So I'm going to even go one step further. They should feel safe, not just, well, you're not physically, but I'm under threat of violence. So I'll extend it there. I'll stop there, but we will organize a separate webinar to specifically address this topic of domestic violence. And this idea of, well, the service member suffered and they are entitled to beat people up, kind of nonsense, right? They're not going to say it that way, but that's kind of what they're implying. They've been through a lot. You need to be understanding. I will tell you, the U.S. is not understanding. It's not acceptable under any condition, full stop. And there's a role for both the military and the community involved in all of this. So we'll organize and how at least the U.S. approaches it and see whether or not that would make sense for the Ukraine to have similar type of systems in place. So I'll stop there. Next question. Jim, did you want to say anything on that? I'm sorry.
The only comment I would make is that it's not uncommon for there to be violence in the relationship even before the military service, if these people were connected then. So the idea of safety first and having a contact with a professional is really important.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks, Natalia.
Good afternoon. I have a question. I work on the project with the spouses, and also I am work as a psychotherapist. One of the last situations I encountered is that the military man is missing. So how can I support the spouse who doesn't know whether her husband is alive or not? So I understand that 5 minutes wouldn't be enough, but this subject probably would be interesting for everyone. This issue of uncertainty, this issue if he is in captivity, whether he will come back or not. How can we help these women?
I will tell you that one, thank you for that question. It's not a question that we address obviously in the spouse Battlemind training, but it is a very, very important question. The most recent experience that the U.S. has of this challenge was during the Vietnam War. And their basic approach, and we all look to see if there's anyone who can talk about in some detail about it. I have some knowledge, but fundamentally what you try to do is the spouses would form support groups for each other. So a support group seemed to be the model that was used. And that's, of course, really, really important because, then they could, but it would be facilitated by a psychologist or social worker just to ensure that the group thinking maintained an optimistic, if you will, strength-based approach. They didn't use the word strength-based approach back then, but it was, if you look at what they tried to do in the sessions, was maintain positive. Looking after the mental health and well-being of the spouses is really, really important here. And then there's this whole thing around guilt, like when do you let go? When do you accept that missing in action becomes killed in action? and that they're not coming back? How long should spouses wait? Let's say you're not married. Let's say it's a partner. How long should you wait to find out? And so all of these things were discussed in these support groups. I'm not going to call them therapy groups because it really wasn't therapy, but it could lead into therapy. But that's the approach they took during the Vietnam War from my reading. I did talk at some length with an elderly spouse of a Vietnam veteran who was missing in action for many years and then was confirmed killed in action later. And she was describing to me what sustained her. But there's never been a real systematic study of like what's the best practices. But it just seems to me a support group would be the best place to start, bringing people with similar experiences and similar challenges again. Normalizing symptoms and reactions is kind of like the concepts we developed in Battlemind, normalizing the symptoms and reactions. What are some things they can do for themselves and the family to build skills? And then recognizing when they themselves might need help. So it's not exactly, but it's the whole idea of normalizing symptom and reactions. You're not unique in thinking, don't feel bad because you're thinking about starting another relationship with somebody else after the service members. Now, of course, you haven't, in Vietnam, there were like 10 years waiting on missing in action. You're not at that level yet, but these kinds of thoughts and emotions are very common. So normalizing them becomes really important. And then any skills, the support group is really good, because shared experiences are really important because then people, okay, others are thinking this too. Having it facilitated allows for a richer expression of those shared feelings, emotion, thoughts, and behaviors. So I'm going to stop there. Jim?
I would only add that there's actually a professional literature around some of this under the heading of ambiguous loss. And we see that often in civilian tragedies or even naval tragedies where people are lost at sea or aircrafts go down in the ocean where the bodies have not been recovered, where people wonder and worry. Maybe the most important thing I can add from an organizational level is the importance of transparency, that people who are in leadership positions speak the truth and speak accurately to family members, not just spouses, but other loved ones. So it's an important topic, and we can maybe further develop that as we go on. But there is some literature that supports how best to cope with what I'm calling ambiguous loss.
Thank you, Jim, for that. I'm writing that down. I've not heard of that concept. So this is why we have more than one person doing this. So next question, please. Oksana, I see a hand raised, but...
Yeah, it's Sergey. Sergey, please go ahead. Пане Sergey.
Good afternoon. I wanted to react to the previous question. I would like to speak from another side as I worked with the servicemen who were released from prisons, and we were working on their ability to survive in captivity. And mostly the main resource is the family. It was the family that helped the prisoners of war to survive this expectation of coming back home and rejoining the family. So when the long-awaited coming back home occurs, a very complex process is how to reintegrate with the family. Sometimes the spouse might have another family already. She might have children with another husband in case of a long period of captivity. And it is important to tell this to the servicemen correctly. Mostly we are focused on mental health and well-being of the servicemen, but on the other hand, it is important that at the moment of the return and at the moment when the notice of the serviceman being missing or being in captivity is received. And it is important to support the families so that they manage not to harm the serviceman in isolation. And here, the joint effort of military psychologists and family is needed in order to plan this support. So we start working with family right on the spot when they get the notice that the serviceman went missing. And we try to ensure the social inclusion. We involved social workers, etc. Unfortunately, the volume that we have today, the number of servicemen and civilians which are held as prisoners of war, is so great that we are unable to perform this work with good quality because we don't have enough time. But the correct way to do it is to work simultaneously with the family and with the service when he comes back from the captivity. Sergei, could you write in the chat the name of your project and the name of your partners, please? The organizers know this information, so you can get it through the organizers of this event, if it's possible.
Thank you.
Дякую.
Do we have time for more questions, Oksana? I know we're over time. I apologize.
We are ready. If Chris allows us, then we have tons of questions. I don't know how much time we have. Chris, could you comment a bit, please? We do have questions from these registration forms and Olga. Oh my, thank you so much. God save you. Olga,
Thanks,
could you
Chris.
please?
Thanks. My apologies too. Totally my fault.
Ольга, are you ready with questions? Ольга, ви готові з питаннями?
Yes, good afternoon. The first question is related to short leaves. Could you give recommendations on how the servicemen should make use of their time during their short leave and how the family could support them best in this situation?
Natalia, do you want to start that? I mean, I can tell you what the U.S. did, but the leave system that we managed in the U.S. during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were very, very different than the leave processes as I understand them that are happening in the Ukraine. So I think that, Natalia, you probably have the most insight into that in terms of what would be useful advice.
Thank you, Karl. I will give it a try. Yes, it happens differently depending on the experience of the serviceman, on which combat missions he was involved in, and what kind of remote support he received from his social environment. In any case, as regards the short leaves, are we talking about the short leaves less than 10 days? Is that correct? Unfortunately, I can't tell you because this includes several questions from our participants. Okay, so the short leaves were 10 days. Now they were made a bit longer, and they might include the travel days or not. So firstly, when the serviceman comes back home, he should be given time to sleep enough. And I always emphasize it during my courses, is that when the commander knows about the particularities of the serviceman, the serviceman should be able to tell his family members about the rest he needs, because sometimes the serviceman comes back home and just keeps sleeping for 3 days without even taking off their clothes, and the family members might get worried that they are doing something wrong. In other cases, the serviceman take shower, take off the uniform, and they feel restored on the second day, and then they start interacting with children, cooking, etc. So it depends. One thing which is important to understand is that if during a short leave the family members witness a certain emotional event, some very loud emotional manifestation on the street or at home. And it is important to explain to the serviceman that you have just came from the battlefield, and this is a normal reaction of your nervous system. This is a natural process, and in this way we can show that we accept these manifestations, so that the serviceman is not ashamed of these manifestations, these bodily manifestations. Otherwise he will become aggressive, because that's our defensive mechanism. So simple things: rest, and if the serviceman wants to go somewhere, we can ask him what are his wishes, and everything should be done to normalize the serviceman's reactions, because during the rest time the body can manifest different aspects.
And the last point is an intimate process, sexuality. Talk through this. If there's good bodily contact, interact and talk things through as to what is okay for whom. This is also an important point, to make sure that there are no things that are not talked through before the departure that is imminent. This is a broad topic. A lot can be discussed, but I will stop there. Yes, thank you. And if possible, I would also ask one more question, or shall we give the floor back to the audience?
Аудиторія.
The audience seems to be
waiting for us. Ольга продовжує. Тоді продовжуйте, поки у нас є можливість.
While we still have a chance. Yes, 3 questions about the organization of support. I will try to bring them together into one. How does comprehensive support of families look within the structure of which this training is ongoing? How can it be organized, and what kind of training does a psychologist need for this kind of work?
Natalia, did you want, I'm kind of kicking all of these balls over to your side. Feel free to, I would just very, very briefly, the way the U.S. approaches this is they try to make sure that first and foremost, the mental and physical health care needs of the family, the spouse and the children are met. Then what gets layered on top of that is what I will call generally social well-being programs. So things like recreation, things that families would enjoy doing together. And to include, in the U.S., there are military schools on many of the military installations where the children go to. So there's this community that also gets created. And then at the unit level, they have family readiness groups that, again, can bring families together, can bring spouses together. And then on top of that, there is organizations within the Department of all the services, but in the Department of Defense that are focused on family readiness initiatives. So it really is from the top all the way down to the bottom. There are support structures in place that really, if you think about it from the bio, psychosocial, spiritual, financial health framework, that they're covered down on all of those. So that's the holistic approach that we try to take. Obviously, doing something like this is a huge challenge. So I'm not going to say it's working perfectly in the United States. There's always room for improvement, but they do try to take this holistic approach, multi-level approach from the individual to the family, to the communities, to the installations, and then with the policies and funding that all accompany that. So I'm just going to stop there. Jim, by the way, is the real expert on this, so I probably should have actually given him this question right from the get-go. So, Jim, anything you want to add to that?
You gave a good answer, Karl. I would only add, and this may be true for Ukraine, that often we have reserve and National Guard soldiers in America, other service members who are not on our military installations, who live spread out through the country. And often there are nonprofit organizations, volunteer organizations that spring up, that reach out and try to provide support to these families. But the critical issue is finding connections, finding opportunities to be with others, and to have that kind of support, not only during a deployment, but even after individuals come back home and there's a readjustment period, having that kind of support. And I would just add, it's extending today's conversation, but we think about this in terms of parents and other family members who may be profoundly impacted by military service. So we're always cognizant of that.
Olia, maybe last question, maybe, okay?
I think other questions that were raised in the registration forms have already been covered, either in this session or the previous webinar. So thank you very much for your answers. That's all the questions that I have. These are all the questions that I have.
Thank you.
Then I will just jump in for a couple of moments and say to our audience that Jim and Karl are two our precious people, our precious colleagues who have been bringing their colleagues for us for 2 years already. Can you imagine that? for 2 years, they have been asking their colleagues to join us and to read lectures for us. And I'm so, so thankful to them, and I appreciate their help and support so much. And we have all the recordings of their webinars and their colleagues on YouTube. Please join and watch them. And I wanted to say that I'm very proud of what I have heard from Natalia, that she is Ukrainian. She comes from my country and she does such a great job that really makes me so happy and glad that we do have such colleagues. Thank you for everybody who participated today, and please save yourself because we need to save our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all very much for the questions. And I'm, again, my apologies for not being able to get through all the slides, but I think you got a flavor for how we approach things in the United States and really the underpinnings of our training. We call it Battlemind training, but you know, it's really intended to really lay the principles. Every country is different. Every country has their own challenges. It needs to be modified and tailored to the demands and the culture in which it's being delivered. So feel free to do that. Don't think that you're changing something. I've given you the 3 principles, and you know, and that's how we approach things. We try to just keep those in mind without it being how I say academic. We are very, very applied in how we approach our resilience training, our this is really broadly psychoeducation. And I do want to just say, and I said this, I think, a year ago when Amy Adler and I did the Battlemind training, when we first were doing psychoeducation and proposed to do psychoeducation, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, everybody knew that psychoeducation was a waste of time. There's no point in doing it. It doesn't do anything. And what we set out to show almost 20 years ago was, no, that's not true. Good psychoeducation can be very meaningful and very important. And we showed you the data from our group randomized trials we did showing that. And we built it on all of these principles that I'm talking about, because most of the psychoeducation will never, ever go through group randomized trials. They're too expensive. They're too time consuming. You have to have a huge research infrastructure to do these things. So we built all of them on these basic principles. So while we were testing specific psychoeducation, we think what we were really validating were those underlying principles. And Dr. Adler and I have published on those. So as long, I think, as you keep these underlying principles in mind, no matter what the psychoeducation is, it's likely to be shown to be effective. And so if there's any sort of contribution I personally made, and I don't, as you know, it's not about me, but it's really showing that psychoeducation can work and it can be very impactful on one's well-being. And so I'm going to just stop there, but I just really want to hit that point of why I kind of really tried to focus on these underlying principles and what they look like in training. All right. So you'll notice there's no Yerkes-Dodds models in our training. There's no theory presented because spouses and soldiers don't need that. They don't need to know that stuff, right? They want to know, I'm suffering. What can I do? My husband's gone. I'm worried about it all the time. What can I do to stop worrying? These types of questions we have. So that's what we tried to help them understand and help them get to. And it's not easy. It's an iterative process. And so, you know, like I said, feel free to change it so it matches, but just try to keep those principles in place. I'm sorry, go ahead, Natalia. I'm shutting up. I'm done. Thank you all very much. So, Natalia.
Thank you, Karl. I would like to thank you, Karl and Jim, for this meeting, for responding to our call. I'd like to thank Oksana for the invitation, that everyone has responded, because this is a very painful theme. And it's very important for us in Ukraine now. the principles that we reviewed today seem very important to me, because we cannot give a military psychologist to every serviceman who will be reminding and telling them what to do. No, this psychoeducation will be the basis for them. When the military psychologists give information to commanders of different level, they can deliver this information to the servicemen, who can in turn communicate it to the wives. And if we have psychoeducation for communities, it will be sort of going back to the military anyway from the other side. And due to that broad psychoeducation, we can cover this audience for whom it is important, and we can support broad circles of the population. Thank you very much for these principles, for these approaches, who are quite workable in our conditions as well. I've heard your information that Jim is an expert in system building, and I think we can go back to that topic with sort of more of a subject matter conversation, because we're only building the system in Ukraine, and we're very grateful for your experience. On our turn, we're very happy to support this initiative and this support structure and uphold it and raise it to any level that we can. I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. Thank you.
Let me make just a final comment then, and that's to all of you who are attending today, and to recognize the importance of your presence in the lives and the well-being of your soldiers, your service members, your families. All of you are contributing to the success of Ukraine, and that's going to be important now and in the future. So Karl and I are pleased to try to provide what help we can. But again, thank you, and be well.
Yes, thanks. We are very thankful to our interpreters as well. Please also save yourself, because we need you so much. Thank you very much. And to all the volunteers who contributed for today's webinar, thank you very much. Okay, have a good evening.